Retro Quickies. Adventures of Tron.
Tron is one of those Disney franchises that I find myself constantly forgetting is owned by Disney, or that it's actually a franchise. Since the first film's release in 1982, it's only had 3 major motion picture films, the third of which is scheduled to come out this year in 2025. A short film, and also a series. However, Tron as a franchise, taking place in a digital world inside of a computer, seemed to really thrive in the realm of video games. While there hasn't been an avalanche of Tron games over the years, the franchise is certainly more prolific there than it was in its original medium. Heck, there was even a game based on the original movie that came out the exact same year the movie was released, in 1982. Or a year afterwards in 83. I checked a few different sources, and there seems to be some disagreement on when exactly this game was released. And I'm gonna be honest, the game itself isn't nearly as interesting as the fact that there was a game released on the 2600 during the same year, or just after, when the American console market would crash, and it was released by one of Atari's main console competitors at that time, Mattel. Mattel had their own video game console available at the same time, the Intellivision, which had come out several years ago back in 1979. This isn't even a case where they released 2 versions of the game, one on their own console and one on the competition. No, the game only received a version on the Atari. This sounds bizarre nowadays, but given the fact that it was so early in the medium, there weren't really a lot of standards for what was a do and a don't when it came to what platform you published your games on. And the game itself? It's a pretty basic and typical high-score romp that only marginally has anything to do with its source material. Apart from the manual containing information on the story of Tron and the rather impressive gradient-filled title screen at the start, you could have called this game basically anything. Though to be fair, that is not something that is unique to this game. Licensed games in the Atari era weren't exactly able to realistically portray the licensed material in the best light most of the time. The game is a simple score attack arcade game, where your ultimate goal is to capture all of the bits floating in the air scattered along the 4 floors of each level while avoiding the enemies that spawn in. And I do mean just avoid, you have no means of fighting back or defending yourself at all in this game. Once you have all the bits, the level turns blue, and you just have to hop into the big pillar of light in the center of the screen, and you'll be shunted up to the next level, where everything looks exactly the same, but it's just moving a little bit faster. Continue this until you run out of lives, as the game does not seem to have an end state. To be fair, it's a decent enough gameplay loop. There's not a whole lot that really makes it exciting or interesting, but it's a fun time waster. I do wish that you could do more than just avoid enemies, but the game actually gives you a lot of options for how to do that. You not only can jump over them, but so long as you aren't on the bottom floor of a level, you can drop down to the floor below you just by hitting down in the jump button at any time, which is going to be your main way of avoiding most threats. This is especially true when the game starts to throw the second enemy type at you. Freaking tanks. Tanks will fire in whatever direction they're facing anytime you're on the same floor as them, regardless of whether you're in front of them or not, making them not only the most dangerous threat in the game, but also the most annoying, as the gunshot sounds that you get every time they fire is deafeningly loud compared to the other beeps and blips in this game. Enemies will always spawn in a predictable pattern, always spawning in groups of 3 at the top left and zigzagging down from floor to floor. Tanks will spawn by themselves, but considering how dangerous they are, that makes sense. You ascend floors by using these elevators, but the way that they work is kind of interesting, or annoying depending on how you view it. You can only use them to go up 1 floor at a time. In order to go up another floor, you have to run to the center, jump across the central gap to, I guess, pull the lifts back into position, and then you can use them to go up another level. So while you can descend whenever you want, the fact that you have to do some legwork to keep moving up actually makes the bottom floor one of the most dangerous places to be in terms of avoiding enemies. And avoiding enemies is actually kind of easy in this game, at least at first. See, one of the big criticisms you can lobby at 2600 games in general is how stiff their controls can be. Not helped by just how unforgiving the console's joystick is. But the controls in Adventures of Tron is actually a lot more responsive and free-flowing than I'm used to in games of this age. At no point during my playtime did I feel like the game was fighting against me while I was playing, which is a bit of a rarity. Descending and jumping is nice and snappy, and while enemies will quickly outpace you in terms of speed, Reversing direction and moving around feels good and decently speedy. The one downside to the controls is the fact that your jump is more akin to early Castlevania games. You either jump straight up or you jump forward and an arc, but you can't influence your momentum at all. You are committed to that jump until you hit the ground, regardless of what's underneath you. This doesn't pair well with the enemy movement speed. It only takes a few levels before they're moving so fast that actually jumping over them as a means of avoiding them is almost impossible, especially since so many of them spawn in groups together. And it also doesn't pair well with the game's very particular hit detection. When you hit an enemy, you're dead. The game gives you no mercy when it comes to touching them. But the bits? The things you're supposed to collect? Actually grabbing them is surprisingly difficult, especially if you're jumping in an arc when you try to grab them. The only way I was able to grab them without having to worry about missing them was to jump straight up into the air so that I was right at the apex of the jump when the bits passed over me. And even then, it still felt like they passed through Tron more often than they should have. You also don't seem to be able to grab more than one bit at a time, which, considering there's always at least two on each floor, even if you jump to grab them both at once, you'll only get one, if that. And there's also this weird little thing flying around as well. I don't really know what to call it, but if you run into it, it'll shove you backwards. It isn't like it hurts you, and it's only really dangerous if you run into it while there are enemies moving in the opposite direction, so it's mostly just there to be annoying, and thankfully is only on one of the 4 floors in each level. All of these little annoyances are easy enough to avoid and deal with when you're early on in the game and everything's moving slowly, but once the game starts speeding up and it feels like every floor has at least one group of enemies rolling all over it, that's when it starts to get more frustrating. You can survive for a good long while with the generous means the game gives you of getting out of everyone's way, and I will applaud the game for being very easy to understand and play without having to look up a guide or a manual or anything for the basic controls. But it can often feel like that's all you're doing is just surviving and just avoiding things. It isn't like the game has a time limit on the stage or anything. You can take your time and pick your spots to grab the bits when it's safest to do so. But as enemies become faster and more numerous, it won't take long before it feels like running away is the only option you feel like you have. The game also lacks a lot of the more addictive qualities of many other arcade games of the time that really makes you want to keep going, like with Space Invaders, for example. It also lacks a lot of variety, as apart from speeding up as you climb the tower, every level is exactly the same in terms of layout and threat level, meaning that your approach to every situation is going to be pretty similar. But that's basically it for Adventures of Tron, and I hope I've made clear why calling this an adventure is a bit of a stretch. It's not a bad game. I dare say it's rather impressive that it plays as well as it does, considering that it's a licensed Atari 2600 game, but the license itself is completely superfluous and barely represented in any capacity here. And while the game is solid, it's also incredibly basic, with just enough janky quirks to make it a bit too annoying for extended play sessions. I wouldn't say no to picking it up for a quick burst now and then, but I'd tire of it very quickly. Kinda sounds like how Disney feels about the Tron franchise in general, all things considered.